Welcome to a tasting of new Rita Spritz.
Will they read? Thomas, you're on the Atheist Experience with Jenna and Matt. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you, Matt and Jenna?
Great. How are you?
Not too bad.
So, Matt, this is going to be my third time calling in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you remember, but at the end of our last discussion, you told me to look into the fact that you referred to consciousness as an illusion. There to be an illusion, something needs to be deceived. So, therefore, consciousness is something other than an illusion. And if consciousness is an illusion, then our minds are something in and of itself, because we experience the illusion. Do you agree?
So there's a brain that experiences, that it gets information from our senses and it processes information on its own. It does thinking. And so there's a brain there which can be deceived. And the notion that consciousness is potentially an illusion upon the brain, because what consciousness is not particularly well defined or well understood, which is why philosophers continue to debate the subject, and why scientists are investigating things like, okay, do I make a conscious decision, or does my brain make a decision that it then rationalizes as if it were a conscious decision? And there's some science that seems to suggest that your brain makes decisions before you are consciously aware of it. But I'm just going to set all that aside and say, okay, so what? I don't know, you know, the fact that, so I would agree, and I think you would, that you and I are both conscious, correct?
Yes.
Whether it's an illusion or something substantive, I tend to prefer to look at consciousness as an emergent property of how a brain functions. You know, so when a brain does things, it essentially produces consciousness, or what the experiences that we call consciousness. But I don't know what that has to do with theism, atheism, gods, etc.
Okay, well, I'll try to get there. I would agree that consciousness is not well defined, but I don't know what your views on AI is, but I don't think AI is conscious, at least not yet. That's what some of the top scientists say. Would you agree that AI is not conscious?
I have no reason to think that AI is conscious yet. But I also don't have any reason to exclude the fact that it could eventually become conscious.
Okay, but for the moment, in the present, they are not conscious.
Not as far as I can tell.
Okay, so although consciousness may not be well defined, I would refer to consciousness as something, thing in and of itself.
I don't know. I don't know that I could say it's something in and of itself, because it's contingent upon a brain. Like, we have no examples of consciousness absent a brain, do we?
No, not necessarily.
Do we have any examples of consciousness that isn't part of a physical functioning body?
No, we don't, but we may not.
Does God have a physical functioning body?
God? No.
So God's not conscious?
I would say that God is consciousness.
Well, then you think you have an example of consciousness absent a brain, right?
Wait, if God is consciousness.
Or, oh, that's different from God is conscious.
Yeah, he said God is consciousness.
Yeah, I'm saying.
Okay, so
yeah, he is consciousness.
This is consciousness. So the experience that you and I are having, where we would both call that consciousness,
right there.
you're saying that's God?
And that's basically what I think too. And now I know Matt is gonna like just rip this whole thing to shreds, that God is consciousness, and there's no proof of it. There's absolutely no proof that God is consciousness. But I absolutely believe that there is only one consciousness, and we're all a part of it. Whatever it is, this thing that allows us to be aware that we are aware, is the God function. Now, how did this consciousness create matter and energy and electricity and gravity and ionic bond? And that's all beyond me. And that's the only thing that, I don't know, I guess that is faith or whatever, but not in a religious sense. But Matt and the gang, they always go against everybody who thinks like me too. They're like, you're fucking dumb. I think they call it deism, is when you believe that there is a God, but it doesn't have any significant effects on what we know as reality, and it doesn't interact in everyday the natural world as we see it. I think that's deism. And so that's basically almost where I stand at. But not really. So I'm trying to, I keep listening to these shows to see who and where and what I agree on the most. And like the guy said, he's called in 3 times. And I think I've heard him on a different call before. But like, yeah, when it comes down to consciousness, and like even science can't explain consciousness. Why? Because that's a part of God that we just won't know how it works. It's the system. It's the way that the things are ordered. And it's just how it's supposed to be. And it is the way it is because that's how it's supposed to be.
That is,
The thing,
Consciousness.
but we may not.
do we have any examples of consciousness that isn't part of a physical functioning body?
No, we don't, but we may not.
Does God have a physical functioning body?
God? No.
So God's not conscious.
I would say that God is consciousness.
Well, then you think you have an example of consciousness absent a brain, right?
Wait, if God is consciousness.
Or, oh, that's different from God is conscious.
Yeah, he said that God is consciousness.
Yeah, I'm saying.
Okay, so
Yeah, he is consciousness.
this is consciousness. So the experience that you and I are having, where we would both call that consciousness, you're saying that's God?
That is part of God, yes.
Yes,
How do you
it's
know?
a part of God.
I would draw certain logical conclusions to get there, but
Which ones?
first I would ask you: has consciousness naturally occurred?
No evidence that
You're-
anything that we would say exists has not occurred by any means other than natural. So,
Okay, so
as far as we can tell, whatever consciousness is, it's natural.
Okay, so just to clarify, when I refer to myself as I am referring to my consciousness, and when I say you, I'm referring to your consciousness. And the same goes for a dog or a mouse. When something
Say
when
you, you're
something
not talking about me and my body and my consciousness and everything about me. You're just, when you say you, you're talking just to someone's consciousness?
Yes, I believe that is what I is or you is.
So when I'm asleep, does that mean I stopped existing?
I had a feeling you might say that, Matt, but
Cool.
no, it does not mean you have. It does not mean you have stopped existing, but it does mean you are not conscious at that moment, unless you are perhaps dreaming or something.
Well, that would actually be subconscious, although there may be, but in any case, there are moments where I'm not conscious, even though I'm still a potential thinking agent. And so what Jenna was asking about, are you only referring to someone's consciousness as the I and you? Well, clearly there's a problem there, because there are things about me that either aren't directly a part of my consciousness, or may be present in the absence of my conscious awareness.
Like, what could be present
My
outside of
pinky.
your consciousness?
My pinky.
Well, that's part of your body.
Correct.
Which is not part of my consciousness.
Okay, so it's part of my body. Let's just take my whole body.
Okay, so when someone dies, their consciousness is no longer with that body. So they're not there. And if their body is there, but not there, or would you say that they are still there?
So do you mean
Even though they're
consciousness
dead.
or do you mean soul?
I'm referring to consciousness.
Okay.
Is that different?
So I have not taken the time to define a soul. I guess some people may call it a soul, but I'm referring to it as consciousness.
Okay, so I just went to my grandmother's funeral a couple weeks ago. Clearly, she's no longer conscious. And yet everything else about her body is still there. And so the question becomes, is she there? Now, I understand the natural feeling. This is how we got to the idea of a soul in the first place, is I'm standing here talking to Jenna, I drop dead, and all of a sudden I'm not able to move or function, and the only reasonable conclusion that, or the inference that Jenna can make is there's something about me that used to be here and is not here anymore. That's kind of what you seem to be talking about with Guard. However, the question I have is, the consciousness is no longer there. My grandmother's dead. She's not conscious. There's no consciousness there. I also recognize that the rest of the person is still there. I realize that consciousness is the part that we care about. It's one of the big reasons we make this distinction between the living and the dead. But I have no evidence that her consciousness went somewhere. It's what I have evidence for is that her brain stopped functioning and producing the thing that we call consciousness. That's it. So even if we were in complete agreement that the consciousness is the self, and I think there's a context in which I'm kind of okay with that. When somebody dies and there's no longer a consciousness there, there is a justifiable context in which you can say that person no longer exists. I don't think she's going to keep getting a Social Security check. But we have no reason to think that the consciousness goes anywhere, in the notion that what Jenna was pointing to about the distinction between a consciousness and a soul. Do you think the consciousness goes somewhere, and why would you think that?
Well, do I think it goes somewhere? Well, a moment ago, you referred to consciousness as something. You said if you were to drop there in the studio that Jenna would realize something is no longer there.
I said that was a reasonable inference, yeah.
Okay, well,
but it's not necessarily a thing that packed up and left.
So
In the same way that when I'm laying here dead, I'm no longer breathing either, but my breath didn't pack up and go somewhere.
So how do you know when you look
well, yes,
at
actually it did.
so how do you know when you
you
look
stop.
at a person and you look at a computer and then a person dies and the computer turns off? How do you know that there is some part of the person that is missing versus it turned off? Or the computer is missing a part now that it's off, or it's just off? Like, do you see, how do you know that there's something that left the person but not something left the computer?
Well, a computer, you can fix it. Comparing the computer to a human is kind of complicated, but you can fix a computer. You can see what has malfunctioned. You can replace parts.
You can do that with humans.
Yeah, but that won't bring the human back to life.
I mean, if you break your arm, you can fix it. If you get a concussion, you can get better. You can
Yeah, but
hurt
you
yourself.
were talking about like in a
Repair
death
parts,
form.
you
Now
can
you're
have
not
all
talking
Get
about
blood
death.
donated.
Yeah, but I was referring to death.
Yeah, death.
And
That's
after
what he
death,
was
there's no
referring
way
to,
to
death.
repair a human.
Really?
Yes, currently.
I mean, what we used to call, first of all, death is actually probably best viewed as a process. And, you know, perhaps you're not dead until you're either warm and dead or cold and dead, depending on the circumstances that led to you no longer being considered alive. But we revive people on operating tables all the time that would otherwise just die. If you left them alone, they would die. But if you apply an electric shock and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and stuff, you can manually manipulate a body so that it remains alive. Now, I don't know what's down the future in the sci-fi realm with the transhumanists. Maybe if you freeze a body in the right way in 100 years, you can thaw it out. But at the end of the day, we're talking about her example with the computer is essentially if the knowing how to fix it, it's off. In the same way that if a body breaks and you have no way of knowing how to fix it, it's now off. And I don't
There is a difference.
Okay, what is it? Well, there is a difference. It's an analogy, but I mean, what's...
You can find someone that knows how to fix the computer because humans made the computer. We put the codes and the programs into the computer.
You don't get to any code if it doesn't power on.
Okay, so on to that point, we can get people that can replace the parts of whatever's broken.
Sure, but...
And run diagnostics.
Can you do that?
And fix it.
Can you do that?
I cannot.
Okay,
I'm not a computer
so
technician.
you can't do that. So now let's say you're the only human left on the planet and your computer dies. Now there's...
I would know that my knowledge is limited, but there is a way for me to gain knowledge and be able to fix it for myself.
Possibly.
I know that that's possible.
Possible,
I know that's possible.
No, it's not necessarily possible if you're the only person left. It may be that you could never perhaps learn that information.
Yeah, it's possible.
Okay. But at the end of the day, none of that matters. Here's the thing. The fact that we know how to fix a computer and don't know how to fix a human is completely irrelevant to what we're talking about, which is you think that the consciousness goes somewhere from a human being, and you don't think that there's anything that goes somewhere when a computer stops working.
Because the computer is not conscious.
So why do you think that there is something leaving the person, but there is not something leaving the computer? That's a little bit more specifically what I'm asking.
Okay, well, let me respond. There could be nothing to leave the computer because the computer is not conscious.
That's just an assertion.
Consciousness.
See, we've already... Stop. We've already agreed that consciousness is ill-defined and not particularly understood. But if your entire argument is it's not conscious, therefore it doesn't fit the example, then we're wasting time because that's a fallacy called poisoning the well. We're trying to come up with examples. Let's set aside the computer entirely. What on earth makes you think consciousness leaves and goes somewhere else and continues to exist outside of a body?
Well, I would not be able to think that if consciousness, as you once said, is true. It has formed over time, and it has not always existed. So is that your belief that we come from, the beginning of the Big Bang, the model?
I'm sure this is an answer to some question, but it's not even in the same ballpark as the question I asked, which is what makes you think consciousness leaves people and goes somewhere?
Well, that was never my point. You asked me, do I think that consciousness goes somewhere, but...
He asked you what makes you think that.
I don't think it goes somewhere. I just think it still exists.
Why?
After...
Well, if you think it still exists... No, stop. We've already agreed that the person is no longer conscious, right?
Yes.
And you think the consciousness still exists. So the inference is there that it had to go somewhere. Are you saying that the consciousness still exists in that person? It's just that it's not evident?
No, you're right. I suppose that means it has to go somewhere.
Okay.
It still exists.
And all we're wanting to know is what justification would anybody have for reaching that conclusion?
Well, I would like to answer that with a syllogism. I believe that might work. A form of reasoning. Using two known premises, we can conclude a third.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you know the difference between validity and soundness within syllogisms?
No, I do not.
Okay. So validity goes to the structure of a syllogism. There are a number of different forms that you can use. And some of them are valid, which means true premises need to lead to true conclusions, and some of them are invalid, which means that the true premises don't necessarily lead to a true conclusion. And then soundness is a judgment on whether or not the premises are true or accepted to be true. And so in order for a syllogism to be sound, it has to be valid in structure, and then it has to have premises that are true or accepted, if we're just talking about basic reasoning. So what's your syllogism?
Okay, I'll give my syllogism, and you can tell me if it's sound. Something has always existed. Consciousness is something. Therefore, consciousness has always existed.
It's not only not sound, it's not valid. You have a structure there where your premises, your major and minor terms, are not structured in a way that is actually valid. Because something has always existed. Matt is something. Therefore, Matt has always existed. See the problem?
I refer to Matt. I refer to his consciousness.
Okay.
Fill in the blank with
Okay.
me.
All right. Fine. Something has always existed. This cell phone exists. Therefore, this cell phone has always existed. Now, do you see the problem?
Yes, but that cell phone is not intrinsic, not naturally occur.
Yeah, nothing about your syllogism included anything about intrinsic or naturally occurring. Now, instead of recognizing that you've shown up with a syllogism that is invalid and unsound, you're just backpedaling to try to make excuses, and that would be an ad hoc or a post hoc fallacy.
Well, a moment ago, I asked you, did consciousness naturally occur? And I said, therefore, that means consciousness is intrinsic.
I agree that as far as I can tell, consciousness is naturally occurring, which means by definition, consciousness has not always existed. It occurred. See, if you take your syllogism, you're basically starting with, wow, I'm having trouble even putting it back together.
Something.
Your first premise is something has existed forever. Okay? Right?
Yeah, yes.
I don't necessarily know that first premise is sound at all. I have no evidence that something has in fact existed forever. And so the first premise, hang on, the first premise is already questionable. I have no reason to think that there is something that has existed forever. Okay, so there's a problem in the first premise. But
in a previous conversation, I've asked you, can non-existence exist, or can nothing exist? And you said there's no reason for you to think that nothing can exist. So therefore, something always existed.
Sure. Okay. Now I see the problem. When you say something has always existed, you are saying something has always existed. Your second premise, though, is then this is a thing, okay? And therefore, your conclusion is this thing has always existed. And the reason I went with the cell phone example or eyeglasses or anything, the fact that there is something that has always existed does not mean that a specific thing has always existed.
So, okay. I have one more question.
Well, hang on. I want to make sure you get that. So let's change the first premise. Or let's look at it this way. Do you think that everything that exists has always existed?
Yes.
In the terms of energy, yes.
Yes. Energy and matter, whatever matter was created at the beginning, yes, it has always existed.
Turned out like
The
trees,
same shit that
like
makes
that.
up my paintbrush, that makes up
This
me, that
pair of
makes up
glasses
everything, has
always
been here
existed.
since the beginning. And that's even science
So,
says all
okay.
matter came
So
from
now
the
we
Big
have a
Bang.
second premise. There are some things that have not always existed. And now we need to figure out if the thing that you're claiming, consciousness, is in the set of things that has always existed or the set of things that has not always existed. And that is the problem. How do you demonstrate that?
Cannot demonstrate that. Well, I guess that my syllogism was not sound or valid. I guess I'll work on another one.
Okay.
I was very honest
Before
with you.
Yeah, before I go, I just want to wanted to ask you, Matt, just to be clear, you say consciousness is at the beginning of the Big Bang.
I have no idea whether consciousness existed then or not. I don't have any reason to think it did, but I can't show that it didn't. And the other question you might ask yourself is, what does any of this have to do with whether or not there's a God?
Well, if it was true, if I could ever logically conclude that consciousness has always existed, then I would assume that whatever that was is probably a God.
Okay, that's another fallacy, because even if we could demonstrate consciousness has always existed, the next question in that chain would be, what is it that serves as a foundation for consciousness always existing? And you're going to reach the conclusion that that's a God, and I'm then going to ask you, how did you reach that conclusion? Because as far as I can tell, that would, at a minimum, just be like an argument from personal incredulity. I can't think of any other explanation for consciousness, therefore God is the best explanation. But you don't get to use God as an explanation until you demonstrate that a God is possible, plausible, and a potential explanation. I mean, I'm not trying to beat you up here, Thomas, because if this was easy, we wouldn't have been doing a show. There'd be no debate or question about whether or not a God exists. There are people that are have been working on this far longer and with far more understanding of logic and reason and evidence than you and I will ever have. And we still don't have any sort of logically sound argument supported by evidence that would lead one to rationally conclude that a God exists. If we did, we wouldn't be doing the show.
Yeah, guess you're right.
It's frustrating as hell. And it's not just frustrating for you and other people who are on your side of this, it's frustrating for us as well, because imagine waking up every day in a world where the overwhelming majority of people believe something you don't, and, I don't know, act and vote based on those beliefs and things like that, and that determines how they're going to treat each other and how they're going to treat other people and what rights people are going to get. And all you're doing is sitting here going, hang on a minute, I'm not convinced that you have a good reason for that. Can you explain it to me? And all you ever get are fallacious arguments and a vacuum devoid of evidence for the proposition. That's a bizarre world to live in.
Well, Matt, you have a great show. You're an intelligent man, and I always enjoy talking with you.
Thank you, Thomas. I enjoy when you call.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show again. I appreciate it.
Sure. You can thank Jenna because she picked you. Pick another one. There. We got Andrew here in Austin.
Hi. Did you read Matthew 5:27 and 28?
Sure, I've read the whole Bible several times.
Okay. Do you know what it says there?
Is that the passage about adultery, where it's not doesn't just have to be physical adultery? If you look at another woman, another man's wife with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart.
Exactly. It says, "Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart."
Sure.
That's. How do you not think that that's a good thing for people to have limits?
You think that's a good thing?
It's called mind control. You're trying to determine what I think and what I don't think. That's one of the stupidest things I could imagine. How can you control or even pretend to control what somebody thinks? And you don't think Jesus looked on a woman without lust? Or any of his disciples?
That's what Jesus said. That is Jesus, what Jesus said right there.
Well, first of all, we'll set aside how you think you know that this is what Jesus said. Second aside, we'll set aside whether or not it matters whether Jesus said it. I don't care who said it. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And so if somebody says, now I will say, if a man looks on a woman lustfully, he's committed adultery in his heart, is absolutely wrong. Because first of all, he's not necessarily married, and adultery is specifically a lustful or sexual action that extends beyond the bounds of marriage. So as a single person, looking on a woman lustfully isn't adultery. And by the way, I put it to you that almost nobody on the planet outside of arranged marriages would have ever gotten married or had sex if they hadn't looked at someone of the opposite sex lustfully. And finally, why is it a man looking at a woman lustfully? Why isn't it a woman looking at a man lustfully, or a man looking at a man, or a woman looking at a woman? This is a misogynist. Hang on.
If you see a beautiful woman, you just go rape her right away?
Andrew, I'm going to let me finish the thought. It's a misogynistic bit of language that is patently absurd. It denies something that is trivial about human nature and the way things actually work, and tries to compound it as sin. Okay, I could care less if somebody wants to call it sin. Now, go ahead.
Well, don't you think it's important to have limits on your sexual desires? Otherwise, everyone would just be raping everyone.
Really? You think people would just run around raping people?
Well, did you just rape someone?
I haven't raped anybody in the last 50-some years.
Yeah, I've never raped anybody, nor have I had the inclination to.
I've been an atheist for 20 years, so it's just amazing.
So you know that's you do.
How do you get from it's probably a good thing if people don't run around raping each other to therefore this statement about lustful thoughts is necessarily morally correct? Please make the connection between those two. How do you get from we should have some limits to what we can do to we need to have thought crime legislation? How do you get there?
What limits do atheists have?
Well, what culture? Tell me one culture that doesn't have limits, and there's every culture on the face of the earth has limits, and they're not Christian cultures. Chinese culture has got limits. Japanese, the most secular country in the world is Japan. They have the lowest rape rate. Denmark, Sweden, they're very unreligious places, and they don't have any rape problem. We have much more rape in the United States
and by the way,
they ever do in Denmark or Sweden.
Religion doesn't seem to be any kind of deterrent to rape. Are you implying that all rapists are non-Christians or non-religious? What about the priests who are raping little boys and little girls?
Where do you get your limits from?
I get my limits from a rational consideration of the consequences of my actions. That's how I determine what's moral. I get it from a foundation that says my actions have an effect on those people around me, and theirs have an effect on me. And if we're going to live cooperatively and share space, we have to recognize that impact. And my freedom to swing my arm ends at their nose, and that I have no right to impose my will over somebody else's will in that type of scenario. That's where I get them from. It's from an understanding.
What's the punishment if you do that then?
You're
just going to die.
Andrew, I get them from an understanding of reality, not an assertion of authority. Now, what was the question?
Well, if you just do all that, let's just say you go out with a gun and you just rape a bunch of people, then you just shoot yourself, what's going to be the punishment for you?
If I go out and rape a bunch of people and shoot myself, what's going to be the punishment for me? I'll be dead.
Yeah.
I'll be dead.
And why?
It's not going to hurt. The bullet's going to go through your head in about a second. There isn't going to be any pain.
That's correct. I'll be dead. Okay, so let's flip the script here. Let's say somebody goes around and rapes and murders somebody, and then after they're done, they get saved. What's the punishment for them?
Oh, the punishment is hell.
No, they got saved.
They got saved. Also,
are you saying that a rapist can't be saved? See, this is the problem. This is the problem with Christian religion. It establishes unrealistic and irrational and immoral criteria by which to live. And then it creates a loophole so that you don't ever have to be responsible for those actions. Andrew, shut up till I'm done. Christianity is not a moral system. It is an immoral system because it specifically says that there aren't necessarily consequences that you're going to have to pay because of a loophole. And what is the loophole? It has nothing to do with how good you are or how morally you act or anything else. It has to do with whether or not you're willing to be a sycophant to an idea. And if you are, then there is now an exception for which you no longer have to suffer a penalty for this. So the idea that secular morality offers no guarantee that people will ever pay for their crimes and their atrocities is not an argument against secular morality, because that is a tenet of Christianity. It is the foundation. The idea that the Christian God is just is directly contradicted by the idea that the Christian God is merciful. Perfect justice and perfect in any mercy are necessarily directly in contradiction, because mercy is a suspension of justice. So do not pretend that your religion is moral and just and then try to attack my position, which is based on reality, because somebody might rape people, shoot themselves ahead, and then not get punished. That's asinine.
If religion is such a bad thing, how come you think, like, I don't know how many atheists are there in the United States? How come everyone isn't just an atheist then?
Because not everybody is aware of how bad and untrue religion is, which is one of the reasons why
You think you're some kind of genius or something? That, like,
actually, yeah, but
figured
why is
this
that
out and,
relevant?
like, everyone else is too dumb to figure it out?
No, it's not a matter of too dumb. You see, I was a Christian for 25 plus years.
Let me ask you a question. Why are you calling in as a Christian? Why didn't you call in as a Muslim, a Buddhist, or a Hindu?
Because my parents raised me as a Christian.
So you didn't have a choice, did you? When did you
No.
choose to be a Christian?
Well, it's just a tradition. Your parents teach you whatever religion they do. So if you were born over like,
so if you
in
were born a
Afghanistan,
Muslim,
you'd be a Muslim.
Yeah.
If you were born a Muslim.
So it has nothing to do with truth then, it's just the way you were raised. See, because on this show we actually care about whether or not things are true, and my genius status is completely irrelevant because I was a Christian for 25 plus years. I did not get smarter when I became an atheist. What happened was I gained more information, I became more knowledgeable about subjects, and I decided to actually care whether or not my beliefs were true. You don't seem to care whether or not your beliefs are true, you just like them.
Because you were born here.
Well, I think it's good. I think you're going to have more happiness in your life if you have limits to tell you what you can do, or
how is that relevant to the truth of your religion? I've already
it's not
said
all true. I know. I was talking to people on the chat here, and they said, well, they're like, read the Old Testament. There's all this genocide and stuff, and I was just saying, well, you don't have to read the whole thing, because you just read, for example, what Jesus said.
Okay.
You know.
So are you saying? I tell you what, we already talked about this earlier. Not everything that Jesus said is true or good or smart or wise either. So why would you care at all what any of them have to say? You're not concerned about truth. You've already just said you can pick and choose and toss aside the things you don't like. So you're inventing your own version of Christianity. So why not just chuck it aside and go ahead and invent your own secular moral system? You don't keep talking about how we don't have limits. I have plenty of limits. And we live in a society that has plenty of limits. As Daryl's already pointed out, most societies have limits. You keep going to this slippery slope thing of, well, if there is no, 10 Commandments or Jesus or whatever, then you've got no limits. You'll just run around raping and killing people. Well, that's already demonstrably false. And there have been multiple studies that actually investigate the correlation between the religiosity of a society and its societal health. And there is always a strong negative correlation. The more atheistic the society, the better they score on societal health factors, from everything from teenage pregnancy rates to STDs to happiness to wealth to murder, rape to healthcare. Now, go out and do some actual research that contradicts this, and then you might have a case for your assertion that I think you'll live a better life if you're. No, you won't. There's no evidence to demonstrate this. This is wishful thinking. Just as not only have you gone and said, well, I'll pick and choose what I want, you've done it in a way where you're just trying to support your own wishful thinking. And until you actually come up with evidence, and until you demonstrate that you care about the truth, we don't really need to waste any more time on it. And I guess we won't.
Austin, you're on the
Hello,
air.
I am from the Austin Stone. I'm sure you know the church.
Okay.
And I welcome you to join it. We've got a great church, and we're pretty much by the book. And I've helped many lost souls find their way, so to speak.
We're not lost. Don't have a soul.
Wait, is this just a call to advertise your church?
Well, I just wanted to start off by welcoming you to join, if you want.
Well,
it
thank
sounds
you.
like you obviously don't belong to one now, do you?
No, you're right.
You're right. We don't.
Thank you for the
But you
invite.
did one time, didn't you?
I did.
Yes, I did as well.
So you didn't feel any warmth when you sang the hymns, or